Last time we spoke about the failure of diplomacy between the empires of Russia and Japan, as well as the Yellow Peril. The Russians said they would demobilize and pull out of Manchuria, but when the time actually came to do so, they suddenly had a change of heart. Japan felt threatened, but extended the hand of diplomacy, trying to thwart beginning a war against a great power. Tsar Nicholas II was being egged on by his cousin Kaiser Wilhelm II, who utilized the Yellow Peril rhetoric to push Russia into a war with Japan. The Russians did not put up a serious effort when it came to diplomacy, basically insulting Japan. Japan could only swallow so much until she would take violent actions. The entire world was in for quite a shock, because a sun was about to rise and a bear was about to tumble. This episode is the Russo-Japanese War Part 1, the surprise attack on Port Arthur. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Maybe you want more of a visual representation of the Russo-Japanese War? Check out my Russo-Japanese War documentary. Also, please check out my growing Patreon account over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for more exclusive podcasts. And again, I just want to thank all of you who've already joined up. You guys are awesome. On January the 13th of 1904, Japan proposed to Russia that she would recognize Russia's sphere of influence over Manchuria if Russia would respect hers over Korea. It was a generous offer to maintain the peace, but Russia's counter-proposal that Japan respect her sphere and influence over Manchuria, and that Korea was basically open grounds, was, to be frank, an insult. It seemed clear to the Japanese the Russians were not serious about diplomacy. The truth was, the Russians were biding their time to build up their military strength in Asia. In February of 1904, Prime Minister Katsura's cabinet decided for war. And you really have to take a step back and look at what a colossal decision that was. Russia was a great power. Japan was considered an emerging regional power. Japan had defeated the Qing dynasty, yes, but in the minds of the great powers, this was nothing more than two lesser nations battling it out. A lot of the attitudes of the day were, as you can imagine, racist. The idea of a non-white nation going to war against a white nation, let alone a great power, was ridiculous. So how did Japan think she was going to defeat a larger empire like that of Russia? For Japan, the prospect of victory would rely on a preemptive strike against her fleet anchored at Port Arthur. Does this sound a bit familiar? Yes, in many ways, you can think of this as Pearl Harbor's prequel. The idea, similar to that of Pearl Harbor, was to deliver a surprise attack and then issue the formal declaration of war afterwards. In the Pacific, the Russian Far East Fleet consisted of 7 battleships, 6 cruisers, and 13 destroyers at Port Arthur. At Vladivostok, there were 4 first-class cruisers with a number of torpedo boats. At Chimilpo in Korea, there was also the protected cruisers Varya and the gunboat Korets. A crucial component of the conflict would be commanding the seaways. Both nations recognized this fact all too well. The Russian Far East Fleet was constrained from year-the-round training by being icebound in Vladivostok for 3 months of the year. Her fleet was also a ragtag bunch with different armaments, speed, armor, and flexibility. Russia was dependent on foreign-built ships, though she was fully capable of building her own. Russia had ships built from Britain, Germany, France, and America. The Russian Navy was based on conscription at 7 years with 3 years of reserve. Now, the IJN combined fleet consisted of 6 battleships, 10 cruisers, 40 destroyers, and 40 smaller vessels led by Vice Admiral Togo. While the Russian ships were this hodgepodge of differing armaments and speeds and such, the Japanese ships were nearly all British-built, uniform, and faster. Alcohol excess amongst Russian crews was also a very serious problem. The Baltic crews spent 6 months of winter ashore because the Gulf of Finland froze. And because of a rather stupid bureaucratic demand for uniformity, all the crews of the Black Fleet did this as well. Thus, Russian sailors spent less time at sea and a lot less time training. The Japanese Navy, under British instruction, spent more time at sea and trained intensively. Japanese sailors were literate, while most Russian sailors were not. These rather small variables would come out to play when dealing with steam-driven warships, the most technologically advanced weapons of the day. Japan held an advantage over the Russians, an intricate spy network run by Baron Akashi Motojiro. He was sent as a roaming military attaché all over Europe, and by 1902 he moved to St. Petersburg, setting up a network using locally based Japanese merchants, laborers, and others sympathetic to the Japanese, making sure to pay more than the Russians did for their intelligence. He gathered valuable information on troop movements, naval development, and he began to support Russian extremists such as Litvinov, Orlovsky, and Lenin. It is alleged he recruited the famous spy Sidney Riley, who went to Manchuria and Port Arthur secretly gathering intelligence, and, if it is to be believed, alongside his acquaintance Ho Liangshun, stole the Port Arthur harbor defense plans and sold it to the IJN. Allegedly, Vice Admiral Togo was given some false information from Riley and other spies around Port Arthur about the garrison there being on full alert. This led him to not want to risk his capital's ships against a very well-prepared enemy. He thus elected to send a destroyer force to surprise attack Port Arthur. To prepare for the war, the Japanese had troop ships prepared in predetermined positions already loaded with provisions and munitions. Aboard his flagship, Admiral Togo read to his admirals a message from Emperor Meiji before all of them lifted a glass of champagne and gave a few banzais. The Japanese press was forced into utmost secrecy. Everything possible was concealed. As the combined fleet departed on the morning of February the 7th, they had an agreement. Whether at Port Arthur or if the Russian fleet somehow found them first, the Japanese would be the first to fire. The IJN combined fleet made a rendezvous south of Chomilpo around Lindsay Island. They were met by the Akashi, who had been tasked with surveying the Russian Navy's movements in the region. The Akashi reported the Russian naval forces had not departed Port Arthur. Everyone sighed with relief. The Russian naval forces outside Port Arthur were unprotected cruisers, the Varyag, and an old gunboat called the Korets. And as I had mentioned, both of these were anchored at Chomilpo at the time. Chomilpo was a designated landing spot for the IJA. 3 troop ships carrying 2,500 troops detached from the combined fleet, escorted by the armored cruisers Asama, Takashio, and Nanusa. There was also the unarmored cruisers Suma and Akashi and 2 torpedo boats. Commanding the small detachment was Rear Admiral Uryu. The Japanese intelligence indicated alongside the 2 Russian warships, there were also numerous warships from other nations at harbor. There was the HMS Talbot, the USS Vicksburg, Italy's Elba, France's Pascal, and Japan's protected cruiser Chiyoda. Chiyoda slipped out of port to meet up with Uryu's incoming force, and then forwarded the information about the international presence. Uryu worried about the political consequences of attacking the Russians in the harbor, next to the international warships, which was against international law. If they could lure the Russians out of the harbor, however, it would be much better politically. Meanwhile, the Russians were in a bit of an awkward state. Many believed hostilities could break out at any moment, but they did not have orders to attack first. The commander of the Korets was quite nervous, and he wanted to receive an update from Port Arthur on the political situation, so he departed from the harbor during the early afternoon. Unluckily for the Korets, she came across the incoming Japanese. Upon discovering the incoming ships were Japanese, the Korets turned around, but some of her gunners were a little trigger-happy, and they fired 2 ineffectual shots. The Korets fled back to her anchorage beside the Varyag and the Russian steamer Sungari. The 3 captains quickly met, watching the Japanese warships also anchor within the harbor. Soon they could see the Japanese troop ships unloading troops and provisions at around 6 p.m. on February the 8th. The Japanese troops went to work occupying the city, and by 3 a.m. on the 9th, 4 IJA battalions of the 12th Division had unloaded without any incident. Rear Admiral Uryu sent a letter to the senior Russian commander, Captain Stefanov, advising him that hostilities existed between their 2 nations, and that the Russian ships must leave the neutral port of Chemulpo. He also indicated he spoke to the other nationalities' captains, warning them to stay clear if a firefight broke out in the harbor. The Russians had until noon to comply. If they stayed, at 4 p.m., Uryu would attack. Captain Stefanov ran over to the HMS Talbot to plead with her British captain to get the other international ships to restrain the Japanese, or at least to help escort them out to sea. Captain Dennis Bagley of the Talbot went out to meet Uryu with a letter signed by the other captains protesting the violation of the neutral port. Bagley had no illusions it was a useless gesture, and he bid farewell to Stefanov, advising the man he should try to escape or surrender. Stefanov spoke to his fellow captains and they agreed surrender was not an option. At 11 a.m., outgunned and outnumbered, the 2 Russian warships departed the anchorage in front of numerous spectators. Varyag's band played God Save the Tsar as the sailors sang the anthem. They sailed directly at the awaiting Japanese fleet. Upon seeing the Russians come out, the Asama trained her 8-inch guns on the Varyag and at a range of 4 miles opened fire. The new Shimose shells began to hit Varyag, and soon Chiyoda added her guns to the duel. Eyewitness reporter Thomas Cohen had this to say of the scene. Her decks were being torn and riven, and men were dashed down in mangled heaps all around each gun, for the guns had no shields to protect their crews. Like the furious wind squalls in the height of a hurricane came the bursting of terrible explosives of the length of the ship, shattering and burning, sweeping away men, pieces of machinery indiscriminately. The Varyag's crew literally ran out of men to carry away the wounded on deck. A shell smashed into the bridge just to the left of the captain, killing his runner. Another shell hit the captain's right, killing his bugler, and taking some of the side of his face off. Most of Varyag's guns were silenced. She took a hit below the waterline and was listening to port. Yet despite all of this, the able men kept to their duty, trying to maneuver the ship by the propellers after her steering gear had been shot off. With no way to fight the enemy, the captain ordered them to return to port, and the maneuver left Korets exposed to fire for the first time. Korets could not even fire upon the enemy because her range was too limited, and soon the Chiyoda began to fire upon her. Korets's captain decided to simply follow the crippled and on-fire Varyag. Suddenly, the gunfire ceased. The Japanese went back to where they had anchored before, and the 2 Russian warships did the very same. Varyag's superstructures were flattened, 2 of her 4 funnels were blown off, and her masts as well. The Russian survivors were quickly taken aboard the Talbot, Elba, and Pascal. The Russian captains decided to scuttle the 3 ships. As the explosions went off, the band aboard the Elba played the Russian national anthem. The Japanese sailors all bowed in a salute. Later within Chemulpo, some of the Russian sailors would be treated by Japanese medical staff, and all were permitted to return to Russia on parole, promising never to take up arms again during this war. Meanwhile, Admiral Togo took the rest of the fleet to another rendezvous point, this time at Elliott Island, some 65 miles east of Port Arthur. Togo's fleet was divided into 3 divisions. The first division consisted of the 6 battleships: Asahi, Hatsuze, Fukushima, Yashima, Fuji, and Togo's flagship Mikasa. They had an overall speed of 18 knots and a displacement of 12,300 to 15,000 tons, with broadsides weighing some 4,000 pounds. The second division consisted of armored cruisers, the Yakumo, Izumo, Iwate, Azuma, and Tokiwa, with an average speed of 24 knots. The third division consisted of armored cruisers Chitose, Takasago, Yoshino, and Kazagi, Additionally, there was 15 destroyers armed with the brand new Whitehead torpedo, capable of 30 knots, and 20 torpedo boats who would take up the role of piquet. Over in Port Arthur's harbor, the inner line consisted of 5 Russian battleships: the Sevastopol, Petropavlovsk, Perevzyet, Pobeda, and Poltava. In the middle line were the battleships Tsarevich and Litvizan, alongside 3 cruisers. In the southernmost line were 3 other cruisers, along with the duty ship Pallada. Patrolling outside the harbor were the destroyers Rastorypny and Bestrashny, around 20 miles out. The commander of the Russian Far Eastern Fleet was Vice Admiral Oskar Viktorovich Stark. It just so happened on February the 8th he had planned a large birthday party for his wife. Some of the guests would include the Viceroy and Supreme Commander Admiral Alexiev, his Chief of Staff Vice Admiral Witkeft, Stark's deputy, Rear Admiral Ukhtomysk, and a plethora of other commanders and their wives. Stark actually suspected the Japanese would attack, most likely utilizing torpedoes in a surprise, but the Viceroy refused to allow him to prepare the fleet for war. Nonetheless, Stark ordered his captains to prepare and repel torpedo attacks. He ordered all ships to put out anti-torpedo nets and to be prepared for action. However, several ships did not carry out these orders, and did not take the situation seriously despite multiple night alarms. Many main battery guns were unloaded, many nets uncast. Entire crews lay asleep in hammocks, and the 2 patrolling destroyers were told not to fire if they saw anything, but instead to report it to the CIC. This was because the Tsar had instructed his Far Eastern forces, for political reasons, that if a war should occur, Japan must be seen to have started it. Alongside this, the majority of the officer corps would be celebrating on the shore or at the party hosted by Admiral Stark on the deck of his flagship, the Petropavlovsk. The celebrating crowd would in fact mistake explosions as cannon salutes for her birthday party. At 7 p.m., Togo released his destroyers, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd flotillas, that had orders to proceed to Port Arthur while the 4th and 5th would try to ambush any Russian ships sailing around Dalny. 10 destroyers were en route to Port Arthur, and each warship held crews of around 50 men each, armed with 2 12-pounder guns, 4 6-pounders, and 2 torpedoes. The 1st flotilla consisted of the destroyers Shirakumo, Asashio, Kazumi, and Akatsuki. The 2nd flotilla consisted of Inazuma, Oboro, Ikazuki, and the 3rd flotilla Usugumo, Shinonome, and Sazanami. They used their searchlights as they advanced towards Laotuchan, allegedly using stolen plans from Sidney Riley to navigate through the Russian minefield protecting the harbor's entrance. At 10:50 p.m., the 1st flotilla came across the 2 Russian destroyers on patrol, the Rastoropny and Bestytrany. This prompted the 1st squadron to douse their lights, trying to avoid detection and slip past. During the process, the Japanese destroyer Oboro collided with the Ikazuki, disabling her and blocking the path of the Inazuma. This in turn led the flotillas to become separated, and they were soon forced to act independently, with the Inazuma becoming lost and the Oboro limping slowly. 20 minutes after midnight, the 1st flotilla arrived, seeing Russian warship searchlights. Approaching closer, they saw 3 ranks of ships, and then the cruisers Pallada saw the Russian destroyers, but presumed that they were the returning Rastoropny and Bestrashny. The Rastoropny and Bestrashny had no radios, and they were rushing back to try and report the incoming Japanese. At 11:50 p.m., Captain Asai Shojiro aboard the Shiragumo gave the attack signal. The 4 destroyers turned to port and increased their speed to 30 knots before releasing 2 torpedoes each and turning southwards. The Shiragumo fired the first 2 torpedoes, followed by 2 from the Asashio. Because the Pallada was more active, she received more attention than the rest. Pallada was hit amidship, caught fire, and began to keel over. Litvizan was hit next at her bow, creating a hole large enough for a car to pass through. Tsarevich's steering gear was hit. When the explosion of the hit against Pallada was heard, many of the Russian ships began firing wildly. The Kazumi fired her 2 torpedoes, followed by the Akatsuki. Ikazuki, acting alone, came to the scene and fired a single torpedo before fleeing south as well. The 3rd flotilla, attracted by the explosions, rushed to the scene, finding some lights approaching them. They doused their lights and stopped their engines. It turned out to be the Inazuma, who had gotten lost and requested to join up with them. They continued finding the Russian ships in a wild disarray. Usuguma was the first to fire, followed by the Shinonome and Inazuma before they made their escape south as well. Meanwhile, the Sazanami had been separated from all the others since 11 p.m., but she managed to slip past the two Russian destroyers around 1:25 a.m. and came in to fire a single torpedo before she also departed south. The last ship was the damaged Oboro, who attempted to repair herself before limping towards the enemy. At 1:45 a.m., she fired a torpedo and made her escape. The Russians had been caught completely by surprise. Their skeleton crews aboard the battleships had no idea what was occurring. Many men tumbled out of their bunks awaiting orders, but orders never came. To further explain, when a ship is in an action, each individual has his own designated tasks. But when an attack comes unexpectedly, a large number of the crew are absent, well then orders have to be given on the spur of the moment. The explosions were heard by many in the city of Port Arthur, but countless assumed it to be just fireworks for celebration. The Russians' wild attempts at firing back upon the enemy were completely useless. The Norvik was the only ship to give chase to the enemy. The torpedo attack killed 2 officers, 29 sailors, and wounded 8 others. Palada was grounded under the western battery in the harbor. Retvizan was grounded on a ledge near the entrance passage, and Sadovich was grounded close to Retvizan. Out of a total of 16 torpedoes launched, only 3 found targets. A major reason for this was luckily due to the few crews who had deployed anti-torpedo nets as suggested by Admiral Stark. And by the way, if you would like a more visual representation of the attack, there is a fantastic Japanese series on the Russo-Japanese War called Sakanoe no Kumo, narrated by the legendary Ken Watanabe. On my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, one of the most popular episodes on it is that on the Russo-Japanese War, and I used a ton of footage from the series. Even though it's one of my most popular episodes, I do admit I was quite young to YouTube and I made a really big mistake. I actually sped up the narration somewhat because I thought the episode would be far too long. It ended up being about 35 minutes, mind you. But if you can get through me speaking a lot faster, it's a pretty good episode, I'd say. Also, by the time this comes out as a podcast, I hope I am not teasing anything, but I have actually been working on a 10-part Russo-Japanese War series for Kings and Generals. And I can tell you right now, looking at the animation, it is going to be awesome. But back to the story. Stark's staff briefed him on what had occurred, and he immediately reported it to the Viceroy in a manner of, "I told you so." Stark most likely hoped the Viceroy would shoulder the blame alongside him, but instead rumors were spread to exaggerate the fact that he was having a party with his wife during the event. Nonetheless, the two admirals quickly began to plan their next steps as they both assumed the IJN Combined Fleet was about to come in and attack them again. The Viceroy sent a message appealing for everyone to stay calm in the city, while Stark ordered the fleet to be made ready for the sea immediately. Countless officers and sailors scrambled to get aboard their ships. Following the attack at 8 a.m., Togo dispatched Vice Admiral Dewa Shigeto with the 4 cruisers of the 3rd Flotilla to investigate Port Arthur, and, if possible, to lure them out south of Encounter Rock. At 9 a.m., Dewa observed 9 Russian warships getting ready for sea, with 3 aground. The smaller vessels, such as gunboats, torpedo boats, and mine planters, were outside the harbor looking to be in a complete disarray. Dewa approached within 7,500 yards of the harbor, but no one fired upon him. This prompted Dewa to believe the Russians were completely paralyzed. Dewa wirelessly messaged Togo that the Russians seemed to be paralyzed, and that the time was ripe to attack. Togo had wanted to lure the Russians away from Port Arthur's shore batteries, but the report prompted him to order an immediate attack. The Russian formation was quite all over the place. Askold was to the east, Bayan in the center, Novik was far to the west, having attempted to chase the enemy, and many of the other ships were still at anchor. Togo devised his 3 divisions to form a column coming in one after another. Each ship was to fire starboard. The Japanese approached the harbor at 11:55 a.m. Port Arthur was tossed into pure chaos. Warships moved quickly to jettison inflammable materials while coolies and sampans paddled through the jetsam. Captains leapt about demanding status reports of their ships while all they could do was see dark smudges on the horizon. At a range of 8,500 meters, the Mikasa was the first to fire her guns. After firing her 12-inch forward gun, she turned and opened fire with her starboard broadsides. The other ships followed in the same fashion. The Russian shore batteries erupted, firing back at the Japanese, causing a duel between the warship's 12-inch guns aimed at the shore batteries, while their 8- and 6-inch guns targeted the Russian warships. The Mikasa took a full 20 minutes to form her pass and was followed by the Asahi, Fuji, Yakushima, Shikishima, and Hatsuze. Asahi targeted a Presviet type, Fuji and Yashima fired upon cruisers Bayan, Shikishima fired on a ship in the center, and Hatsuze dueled the enemy nearest to her. With the exception of Novik, the Russians moved like ants around a nest beneath the fort guns, trying not to make themselves stationary targets. The Novik charged out of the harbor to meet the enemy and received a hell of a mauling for it. The Russian flagship Petropavlovsk flying Stark's flag was battered. Poltava took a hit, and cruisers Diana and Askold were severely damaged as well. The damage was not one way, by the way. Mikasa, Shikishima, Fuji, Hatsuze, and Iwate took many hits. The shore batteries were becoming increasingly effective. When the 2nd and 3rd Divisions were making their turn, everything had become like a barroom brawl. Within just 5 minutes of dueling, Mikasa had taken a 10-inch shell to her starboard side, which ricocheted and exploded under her main mast. Her chief engineer, a staff officer, a paymaster, 1 midshipman, and 3 crew members were wounded, and part of her aft bridge was carried away. The Fuji received a shell through her forward casing, smashing a stack and exploding, killing a turret officer and wounding many others. Shikishima then received a hit to her forward stack, causing it to explode. By 12:20, Admiral Togo realized that Dewa was incorrect in his assessment. The enemy was not paralyzed, thus he motioned for the fleet to withdraw. After just a single run of it, Togo had decided to back out and rendezvous with Iryu at Chimilpo. The departing maneuver exposed Togo's entire fleet to the full brunt of the Russian shore batteries. The Hatsuze, Fuji, Shikishima, and Mikasa would take the lion's share of the damage, around 7 hits distributed amongst them. As the fleet made its turning point, the Aegean cruisers took several hits as well. Within the 2nd Division, Azuma fired upon Novik, Iwate fired upon Askold, Iwaki fired upon Askold as well, and then the Bayan. As the cruisers turned to port to follow the 1st Division, Azuma was hit by 3 shells. One hit her battle flag, the other off the water off her starboard quarter, which exploded, and the third after her turret. Yaguma was hit twice, one in her forward main top and midshipman. Novik received many hits and fired torpedoes at Iwate, but she missed. Within the 3rd Division, Chitose, the flagship of Dewa, fired on the center, Takasago fired on Bayan, Kasagi fired upon a Sevastopol type, and Takumo fired on the nearest ship to her. Takasago and Chitose had fired on the Askold, which alone came closer to them. A shell hit Askold's 2nd stack, and another hit her forward stack. Chitose then attacked Novik, and Takasago attacked Bayan. As they turned to withdraw, they received no major hits. The Aegean cruisers had launched a salvo of torpedoes. The Novik, trying to engage them even closer, evaded the torpedoes but took several shell hits below her waterline. The Japanese finally got out of range of the dreaded batteries of Port Arthur, lucky to have not had any ships sunk. The casualties were quite balanced for this engagement. The Russians had 150, the Japanese something between 90 to 130. Neither had any warships sunk, but many were severely damaged. For the Japanese, this was not a major issue. Their damaged ships would return to Sasebo for immediate repairs, but for the Russians, this was a major issue. Port Arthur held limited capabilities. They only had 1 small dry dock, and another was incomplete. This meant some of the larger Russian warships could not receive proper repairs, and now they were being blockaded. Many 12-inch shells had fallen into the city as well. The Russo-Chinese bank was hit, causing the employees to frantically burn the currency and prepare coins to be transported away. Lumps of coal littered the city grounds like confetti. Many Chinese grabbed their belongings and fled the city aboard steamers. Many buildings were damaged, but civilian casualties were quite light. When the news of the surprise attack reached Tsar Nicholas II, he was stunned. He could not believe the Japanese would initiate a warlike action without formally declaring war first. His advisors had assured him the Japanese had been bluffing and they would not dare attack. The first secretary of the British Embassy, Cecil Spring Rice, went on the record to state the Tsar was left almost incredulous. Japan issued their declaration of war 3 hours after the surprise attack. Russia went on a war footing on the 10th and a few days later submitted their official declaration of war after stating to the international community Japan's actions were dishonorable. In response, Japan referenced the Russian attack on Sweden in 1808, which they did not do without declaring war first, as a justification somewhat for their own actions. The international community were mixed in their favor, but many did sympathize with the Japanese. Most notably, President Theodore Roosevelt held sympathetic views for the Japanese, and the Japanese would take a strong notice of this. Admiral Togo was disappointed in his lack of success with the surprise torpedo attack. But for now, Japan had won command of the sea. The Russian Navy was trapped. From Chimilpo, Togo sailed his damaged ships back to Sasebo for repairs, but would go on the record to state, "He felt he failed to take the opportunity, as Nelson would have done, to deal a blow to the Russian fleet from which they would never recover." I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. For a more visual representation of this war, check out my episode on the Russo-Japanese War. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for more exclusive podcasts. My next podcast is going to be the strange story of how one Korean man ended up fighting for the Japanese, then the Soviets, and then for the Germans at D-Day. Admiral Togo had delivered the very first blow of the Russo-Japanese War. His surprise attack upon Port Arthur was a bold and terrific strategy. But had he done enough to give Japan the upper hand in the battles to come?